Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You might wonder why I'm introducing the speakers. Well, I'm in the School of Life Sciences, not in Peace Studies, but one of my training was as a toxicologist. And I believe the data tonight are really discussing issues in toxicology. And in fact, I am the editor-in-chief for the book series published by the Royal Society of Chemistry called Issues in Toxicology. So I think the work that will be discussed will fit very well into that scenario. And we have two very good speakers for you, and they are going to talk seamlessly one after the other. At least that's what they say. And we'll take questions at the end for both of them. Now, this is Professor Malcolm Dando. Professor Dando trained originally as a biologist, BSc and PhD at St Andrews University in Scotland, in line with our heir to the throne. After postdoctoral studies in the US, in the University of Michigan and the University of Oregon, he held UK Ministry of Defence funded fellowships in operational research at the University of Sussex during the 1970s. Since then, he has worked on arms control and disarmament, particularly on the chemical and biological issues, and he's got a DSc from the University of Bradford. In recent years, this work has been focused on awareness raising and education of life scientists in regard to the dual use and biosecurity, for example, in the recent Royal Society Brainwaves module on neuroscience, conflict and security, and he is a fellow of the UK Society of Biology. So this is our famous emeritus professor. Now we're moving on to our second speaker, and Dr. Michael Crowley is the project coordinator of the Bradford Non-Lethal Weapons Research Programme, and he is also a senior research associate of the Omega Research Foundation. He has worked for over 20 years on arms control, security, and human rights issues, including as executive director of VERTIC, which is the Verification Research Training and Information Centre, and has acted as chairpersons of the Bioweapons Prevention Project. Prior to this, he worked at the Omega Research Foundation, exploring options for effective restriction of the development, trade, and use of security equipment and technology employed in the torture and ill treatment. He has also managed the Arms Trade Treaty Project at the Arias Foundation in Costa Rica and worked as senior arms trade analyst at BASIC. He has also held several research and policy positions with Amnesty International, both in the UK section and at the International Secretariat. He holds a BSc in Genetics from Liverpool University and an MRes and PhD from Bradford University. So I'm really looking very forward to what they've got to say. So if you'd like to start, Malcolm.
Thank you.
I'll just take my seat over there.
Well, good evening. I hope we have a session which is mercifully brief from us and then lots and lots of questions from you. I tried to make sure that you all had a handout. The only reason for doing that was so that you could have a quick look at it and understand that the issues that we're talking about this evening are very much in the forefront of concerns that the state parties to the Biological Weapons Convention, and particularly the Chemical Weapons Convention, have at the present time. So the work that we're going to talk about this evening started at about this time last year, when Michael and I thought that we probably had about 3 months' work to do, and we could produce a nice report in plenty of time before the meeting of the state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention in November of last year. So just before November of last year, we managed to finish this tome, and just in time for Michael to go and brief it to the state parties at the meeting in November. So it was a much longer piece of work than we had imagined. The intention this evening is not to drag you all the way through all the details of what we've discovered, but basically to try to cut through the main points and then hopefully trigger some interesting questions from yourselves. Is that okay? I should say at the outset that our intention in the work we did was not to argue that any particular state party was deliberately flouting the law set out in the Chemical Weapons Convention. Our concern much more was that in a situation of very rapid scientific and technological change and a certain ambiguity in the convention, lack of transparency about what state parties were doing could lead to misperceptions and responses in kind that might then lead to an erosion of the central part of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Okay. This extract is from the US textbook on military medicine, concerned specifically with chemical and biological warfare. And it recalls that roughly 100 years ago, almost completely 100 years ago, German forces on the Western Front began preparing for the first really large use of lethal chemical agents. And in April of 1915, they let loose chlorine, which was blown by the wind across the Allied front, and it is suggested that some 5,000 troops were killed. That's probably something of an overestimate. But what is clear is that then Germany, using its capabilities in industrial chemistry, rapidly escalated to the use of phosgene, and then the Allies responded with whatever they could produce. And we ended up at the end of the First World War with both sides using a range of lethal chemical agents for a variety of purposes. And if you read the details, you can see that this was in very, very carefully calculated military operations. Wilfred Owen, in his very well-known poem, gave us a hint of what it was like to be subject to such an attack. The Miski frames of those original gas helmets with the big windows on either side, which obviously missed it up because it was first of a rather primitive series of gas marks, and the green light is the agent outside. If you read on through the poem, it's fairly clear that it was either chlorine or phosgene that was being used. And if you know the poem well, you're asked in the following lines to imagine if you were dreaming and what you would have felt like if you had been watching it as they put this man onto a truck and he was coughing and basically dying as they put him on the truck and he was bounced away from where the attack had taken place. During the 20th century, as our understanding of the nervous system increased, for very good reasons to try to help people with mental problems, This allowed the development of ever more lethal and complicated agents. So civil scientists in Germany during the 1930s, working to try to find new pesticides against insects, developed agents which were discovered to be also effective against our nervous systems, and this led to the development of a series of nerve agents. And both sides during the Cold War built up huge stocks, both of the old kind of mustard gas agents and the new kind of nerve agents. But then in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, it was possible for states to agree the Chemical Weapons Convention. And as you probably all know, in 2013, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the international organization which takes care of the Chemical Weapons Convention, was awarded the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, for its efforts in getting rid of almost all of the lethal chemical stocks that had been built up during that century. Obviously, they didn't get rid of everything that was in Syria, for instance, and we've had use of chemical weapons in the messy Syrian conflict more recently. But as you can see in this quotation from the OPCW's Director General Nobel Peace Prize lecture, he said, "Our task is to consign chemical weapons to history forever." So the Chemical Weapons Convention was designed, first of all, to get rid of all of those old chemical agents, and then to turn its attention to how we make sure that there is not an outbreak again of new forms of chemical warfare. Briefly, the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibition is embodied in Article 1 and Article 2. So you can see in Article 1, each state party to this convention undertakes never, under any circumstances, A, to develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, or retain chemical weapons. And this is a very sweeping prohibition because in Article 2, you can see that for the purpose of this convention, chemical weapons means the following, together or separately, and the first subparagraph is toxic chemicals and their precursors, except where intended for purposes not prohibited under the convention, as long as the types and quantities are consistent with such purposes. So peaceful chemistry is protected by the convention, but misuse for hostile purposes of toxic chemicals is utterly banned. Almost. Because there is a problem, and the problem comes later on down in Article 2.9. So under Article 2.9, purposes not prohibited under this convention means, and a series of points are made, and the first one is industrial, agricultural, research, medical, pharmaceutical, or other peaceful purposes. So in order to protect all of that kind of peaceful work, that is specifically excluded from the prohibition. Unfortunately, Article 2.9d states a peaceful purpose is law enforcement, including domestic riot control purposes, which on a natural reading could lead some people to believe that domestic riot control agents are a subcategory of law enforcement chemical agents. And therefore, it might be possible to have legal law enforcement chemical agents other than domestic riot control agents. So domestic riot control agents like CS are permitted for domestic purposes. But what about this possibility of this other category? And if there are, because of this ambiguity and lack of transparency, suspicions that some state parties are meddling in new forms of law enforcement chemical agents based on the development in neuroscience and associated sciences, then other state parties might be so concerned as to start taking measures themselves. First of all, perhaps defensive measures. What if they're doing something like this? What would we need to defend against it if it was used against us? And you can see that kind of concern in the statement, the middle statement in that handout, where the United States both congratulates Australia on raising this issue of new forms of chemical agents attacking the central nervous system, but also adds there's a big concern that people might be doing this as a camouflage, saying it's law enforcement, when what they're actually doing is producing a new offensive chemical weapons program. So that was the issue that we were trying to look at, and we were trying to understand how dangerous misperceptions could be in this area. The Royal Society had spent quite a lot of its time in the Brainwaves Module 3 production on neuroscience, conflict and security, examining this issue. And as the Royal Society pointed out, during the last century, many different forms of methods of incapacitating people with chemical agents were discovered, and many of them were analysed in some detail by both sides during the Cold War. But the important point here is that these kinds of agents are quite distinct from domestic riot control agents. Domestic riot control agents act peripherally. They make your eyes run, they make you sneeze. They don't affect your central nervous system and immobilize you by specific action on your central nervous system. So we're dealing with two very, very different things. One is domestic riot control agents, which are allowed, and secondly, this other possibility of new forms of agents, which could be misused to attack your central nervous system. And you also need to understand that if you were to get such an agent, you would also need to have some means of disseminating it. So there's a question of what kind of dissemination devices or methods are people investigated. The Royal Society went on to state, having looked at some of the literature more recently, that although there are many different forms of incapacitation which were examined in the Cold War period, what seems to be most attractive now is rapid action, short duration agents, which basically put people to sleep. So those are the kind of agents which most work seems to be on at the present time. And the Royal Society then also briefly said, well, look, there are certain categories, classes of agents and specific agents which we know have been looked at in these kinds of programs. And of course, all of these, what confuses the issue is that all of these are also perfectly legal to use and study for medical purposes. So opioids, morphine, fentanyls are more a stronger kind of morphine. So it would be perfectly possible for people to be investigating fentanyl and its derivatives and to be doing perfectly legal things, perfectly allowable. But it could also be that they're up to something else. And if there's not sufficient transparency, then there's a danger of misunderstanding. So what we did was to look at work going on in a relatively small number of countries, mainly countries where literature is in English so that we could easily understand it, although we did get some work from some countries translated. And we looked at information pertaining to the national, scientific and medical community, about particular kinds of work on particular kinds of agents, particular kinds of research establishments where there might be some misunderstanding if they were meddling in this area, and also looking at policy and practice concerned with discussions in that country about these kind of incapacitating chemical agents. So, just a couple of examples before I hand you over to Michael. India. India, I understand from the news last night, is the fastest growing economy in the world at the present time. It has a very large defence research and development organisation, and scientists there have undertaken studies of the synthesis, aerosolization, bioefficiency of fentanyl and its analogues, and we list some of the papers here. Moreover, one particular scientist that we discovered working for this organisation had received an award for his work on the production of incapacitating chemical agents, and a promotion as well, I think. We then wrote to the the specific people in the Indian government who have responsibility related to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and asked them if they could clarify what was going on here. And they argued that what was being done was legitimate scientific defensive work. If it is legitimate scientific defensive work, it should have been reported to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, but we unfortunately don't have access to that kind of information, so that we don't know whether it has been reported or not. And if it hasn't, it raises questions then about what exactly is going on. In Iran, we discovered a very well-known university which was established by the Iranian military guards in the 1980s, and at the present time has a vice-chancellor who's a brigadier general, bringing a certain military strength to the place, I suppose. We found that there was lots and lots of work on fentanyl before 2007, but then a series of papers published on some of these other possible agents, and papers describing attempts to make the dissemination of these agents as effective and efficient as possible. Once again, we wrote to the relevant Iranian officials, and they came back and replied that what they were doing in this university and in this group was solely for scientific purposes. Iran is on record in association with a number of other countries of saying that there needs to be clarification of what is allowed under Article 29D. But it's made no official statement to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons saying that it's not involved in the development of any of these kinds of agents. And I think at that stage, I hand over to Michael.
Okay. Thanks, Malcolm. And I'll take you through, if I can work the technology, I'll take you through some more country examples. Oops, going backwards, forwards. Okay, and the first being the Russian Federation. Now, and you may have seen some of this at the time in the news. Concerns about ICA weapons were heightened following the use of a presumed derivative of the synthetic opiate fentanyl by Russian security forces to free over 900 hostages that were held by heavily armed Chechen separatists in the Dubrovka theatre in the middle of Moscow in October 2002. Now this was a desperate situation, with the Chechen armed group threatening to kill all the hostages and to blow up the theatre. The Russian security forces pumped an aerosolized incapacitating chemical agent into the theatre, putting the hostages and some of the hostage takers into deep sleep. And then, shortly afterwards, the security forces stormed the building, killing all the hostage takers, including those that were unconscious from the chemical agent. And although the hostages were released, over 120 died as a direct result of the effects of the agent used or of airway constriction due to incapacitation. And an undetermined additional number of hostages reportedly suffered long-term and continued to suffer long-term damage or died prematurely in the years after the siege. And treatment of the hostages was delayed and compromised because the authorities refused to tell the relevant health professionals exactly what chemical agent was used. And the Russian authorities to this day have refused to give full public details of the nature of the incapacitating chemical agent weapon that was used, or to provide information on stockpiles or current development of such weapons. There's been some information that has come to light about the agent that was used. Some countries managed to get hold of urine samples, blood samples, or clothing from some of the victims. And in 2012, a paper by researchers at the UK Defence Science and Technology Lab detailed the results of their trace analysis of extracts of clothing and of urine from survivors, indicating that the aerosol comprised a mixture of two anaesthetics, carfentanil and remifentanil. But as I said, the Russian authorities have still not officially publicly stated what was used. And there are concerns that the Russian Federation use of this ICA weapon may have encouraged and may be encouraging other states to develop or acquire such weapons. And particularly vocal in their concerns has been the International Committee of the Red Cross, who are the defenders of international humanitarian law. So, as Malcolm said, we looked at, part of our work looked at open source, publicly available scientific and medical research papers, and just tried to see what was out there that could be applicable to the development of ICA weapons. And with regard to the Russian Federation, we found that Russian researchers have continued work of potential application to the study or development of these weapons. And this included computer modelling of so-called carminative gas flows in enclosed spaces. So part of the problem with ICA weapons, to be effective, you've got to get enough of a dose of the chemical to everybody in this room, so that you'll knock them out. But not too much of a dose to anybody in this room, because if you get too much, you'll die. And so part of the research has been how do aerosolized chemicals move through rooms, and how can you ensure an effective dose reaches everybody. So some Russian researchers have explored that. and they've been detailed in a paper which was given at a self-titled non-lethal weapons symposium at Ettlingen in Germany, and also a more recent research presentation in 2009. And in addition, the UK research paper of 2012 and our own subsequent study highlighted research relating to the synthesis of fentanyl precursors that happened in 2000, and also the study of how opiate receptors in our bodies interact with potential incapacitating chemical agents. And those are detailed in a range of papers from 2005 and 2012. And still, Russia remains silent as to the purpose behind such research. And as Malcolm said, we tried to contact all the states where we had concerns, but we got no response from the Russian Federation. But of course, Russia is not alone. Our study also highlighted the development and marketing by two Chinese companies, Norenco and the State 9616 plant company of ICA weapons, employing an unknown anaesthetic agent, which are specifically promoted for the use by security forces against individuals rather than groups. And we've found the possession of such weapons in 2011 and 2012 by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In the picture on the right, there's somebody demonstrating one of these weapons at an open day, which was held in Hong Kong at an airbase in 2011. And China has released no information on its ICA weapons stockpiles, nor whether it's conducting research to develop ICA weapons targeting groups. Another country where there has been indications of development of an ICA weapon has been Israel. Israel previously conducted research into incapacitating chemical agents, and the Israeli security services have reportedly employed an ICA weapon targeted on individuals on at least one occasion. And in 1997, Mossad was widely reported to have employed an ICA weapon in either a bungled kidnapping or more likely a failed assassination attempt against a Hamas leader in Jordan, so in a foreign country. And it's unknown whether Israel holds stockpiles of ICA weapons. So we don't know the current state of Israel's interest in these weapons at the moment. Israel currently conducts research in potentially relevant areas, but there's insufficient publicly available information to assess the true nature and purpose of such study. Oh, how do we do that? Excellent. Okay. So those three cases, which are detailed in the report, are quite clear examples of possession and or use of ICA weapons. So in Russia, China, and Israel. Our study also examined potentially relevant dual-use chemical and life science research conducted since the Chemical Weapons Convention came into force in 1997. And Malcolm has spoken about India and Iran, and the other countries that we looked at were the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom, and the United States, as well as reports, contested reports of alleged use of ICA weapons in Syria. In certain countries, it's been difficult to establish what's really going on and the true nature and purpose of potentially relevant chemical and life science dual-use research. One example where there's quite a lot of information, but still lack of clarity, really, is the Czech Republic. So we found a wealth of scientific papers published between 2005 and 2007, detailing research on opioids, ketamine, medetamine, and midazolam, which specifically, in the author's own words, highlight their potential utility as quote-unquote pharmacological non-lethal weapons. For example, in May 2005, at the third European Symposium on Non-Lethal Weapons, Czech researchers delivered a paper describing their investigations over several years, administering rhesus monkeys with various pharmacological cocktails in order to determine which combinations and doses resulted in quote, fully reversible immobilization. And the paper also described how fully reversible analgesic sedation was tested in man. Why am I keep doing this? Sorry about this. There we are. Okay, and similar papers were also presented at Jane's non-lethal weapons conferences and at a NATO research technology organisation meeting. And here's an example, just extracts from one paper. In a paper presented in May 2007 to the fourth European Symposium on Non-Lethal Weapons, Czech researchers described how they decided to test new combinations of drugs for suppression of complete abolition of aggressive behaviour in macaque monkeys. And the researchers claimed that the results can be used, quote, to pacify aggressive people during medical treatment, also in terrorist attacks and during production of, again, new pharmacological non-lethal weapons. Czech researchers, as well as looking at the chemical agents, also investigated a number of alternative means of agent delivery, including via inhalation administration, which was initially tested on rats and then on human volunteers, who were in fact reported to have been children in hospital. And researchers also explored conjunctival, nasal, transbuccal, sublingual and transdermal administration. So all different ways to get the agent into the body. And research into these chemicals, including induction of immobilization in the great apes, in orangutans and chimpanzees, continued until at least 2012. But the additional papers contain no explicit reference to potential application as pharmacological non-lethal weapons. They're stated to be for other reasons, such as the safe movement of animals in veterinary practice. Okay, so as Malcolm was saying, in our work we analysed the publicly available data that's out there, particularly the scientific and medical papers, but also repeatedly sought to engage with the national oversight bodies in the states that we studied. And sometimes we had success and sometimes nobody replied to us at all. The Czechs did engage with us repeatedly over a long period of time. The chemical weapons, the national authority in the Czech Republic investigated the Czech research activities and interviewed some of the researchers involved in it. And in 2014 correspondence to us, they stated that, in their opinion, after conducting this research themselves, there was no connection between the research and the creation of any sort of weapons or devices which could be used for military or police purposes, and that each of the research programs had justifiable medical goals, such as combating pain in incurable diseases, but the reporting in public media exceeded the actual results of the research, and thus created a false impression of possible development of some sort of chemical weapons. And that the publications, the specific publications referring to the possible use of opioids, anesthetics and other toxic chemicals with incapacitating effects as chemical weapons, were based solely on the approximation of the legitimate research of the properties of these chemicals into the area of possible misuse. So basically, the researchers were studying these things for medical reasons, but then were postulating about their potential application as pharmacological non-lethal weapons. And consequently, the Czech National Authority confirmed that the CWC national legislation in the Czech Republic absolutely prohibits the use of such agents for law enforcement. And then the Czech National Authority conducted a series of presentations to the various relevant ministries to ensure that everybody knew what the proper application and implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention is in these areas. Okay, so Malcolm spoke earlier about the constraints imposed on states by the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it specifically bans the development and use of anti-toxic chemicals as weapons in war, and that includes ICA weapons. But to date, the issue of ICA weapons for law enforcement use has not been satisfactorily addressed by the OPCW. And no OPCW policy-making organ has made any interpretive statements clarifying whether these weapons can legitimately be employed for law enforcement, and if so, in what circumstances and under what constraints. So therefore, the states parties are left to interpret the scope and nature of their obligations in this area themselves. And when you've got this lack of an agreed overarching position, there's a danger that states will interpret this differently. Consequently, there's a danger of a permissive interpretation and the danger that may evolve. So recognizing this potentially dangerous situation and the implications of such development, certain states, including Australia, Germany and Switzerland, have come out and said that they categorically reject the option of weaponizing incapacitating chemical agents, and formally declaring that the only toxic chemicals that they can use for law enforcement in their countries are riot control agents. And in addition, the UK and the US have formally declared that they are not developing and do not possess ICA weapons. But other states that do possess ICA weapons, or that have conducted research that may be applicable to the study and development of these weapons, remain silent at present, at least in the public OPCW meetings and conferences. Interestingly, one of those states, two of them, the Czech Republic and Iran, have been more forthcoming to us. We engaged with correspondence with the Iranians, and they stated that Iranian law enforcement personnel do not have or use these chemical agents, and that their interpretation of the what am I doing? Here we go. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, their interpretation of the Chemical Weapons Convention is that you can't use ICAs for warfare, but also ICAs, they sort of imply in their response that you can't use them for law enforcement either, and that we move in line with the wish of the states parties to the CWC. And the outcome of the discussions in The Hague, which is where the OPCW is based, with regards to the prohibition of ICAs, will receive a positive response from our side. So, I mean, they've said that to us, but they haven't made such statements publicly in the context of the OPCW. So, we would recommend that in order to address concerns and prevent possible misperceptions, all these states, China, Czech Republic, India, Iran, Israel, and the Russian Federation, at least, should make formal public statements clarifying the nature and purpose of relevant research activities and on whether they are developing, stockpiling, or allow the use of ICA weapons for law enforcement or other purposes. So those states where there might be concerns about their activities should come out and say exactly what they're doing. And furthermore, more generally, we'd recommend that this issue is addressed by all the states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And we recommend that they should, first of all, reaffirm that you can't use such weapons, such agents in armed conflict, and that each state then introduces national moratoria, so halting any start or continuation of development, stockpiling, transfer, or use of such weapons for law enforcement purposes. And that while those moratoria are in place, there's an overarching mechanism for all the states parties at the OBCW to collectively discuss the nature of the regulation of these agents or the prohibition of these agents for law enforcement. And also, at the same time, that states should fulfill the existing CWC reporting obligations. As Malcolm said, in the case of India, they stated that, yes, they are doing research on fentanyl, but it's for protective purposes. Now, under the Chemical Weapons Convention, such protective research is allowed, but you've got to report it to the OBCW. We're not sure, we don't know if the states that are conducting such research all report fully what they're doing. If they don't, then they should do. And finally, where a state has a concern that another state is conducting activities of concern, then it should use the mechanisms that are there in the OBCW to investigate what's going on. Now, the negotiators of the Chemical Weapons Convention were far-sighted enough to build into the treaty language to ensure that it's flexible enough to cover and respond to all the likely developments in relevant science and technology. And similarly, the OBCW, the mechanism, the organisation overseeing the treaty, has established a range of processes which can be employed to monitor and respond to science and technological developments of potential concern. But such safeguards, of course, are only as good as the will of the states parties to actually employ them. And until recently, in the case of ICA weapons, the will to act was not forthcoming. However, there are potentially hopeful signs that a renewed push for action in this area is now beginning to get underway again. Oops, I keep doing this. And that's spearheaded by, at the moment, Australia, who in November of last year circulated a paper and then made statements at the annual conference of states parties. And they've been supported by Switzerland and Germany and Canada and the US and the UK. So hopefully there's a momentum building up in the OBCW now that states actually will address this issue. Because it's an initiative that can't be allowed to fail. If the OBCW does not actively engage with these issues in the near future, there's a danger that an ever-growing number of countries will seek to harness advances in relevant scientific disciplines for ICA weapons development programs, or may be perceived, rightly or wrongly, of doing so. And this, in turn, may convince other states to conduct their own ICA weapons programs, or potentially explore an even broader range of chemical agents and delivery mechanisms, with the danger of a constant spiral of actions and reactions that could weaken or erode away the prohibition on chemical weapons. And if that were to occur, then Wilfred Owen's chronicle of the horrors of chemical warfare on the Western Front a century ago would not just be a powerful memorial to a barbarous past, but could also be a terrible portent of an uncertain future. Thank you.
Right, yes, but can we, just before we have the questions, I just want to say one thing, we've got some time. I'm just going to give you a toxicological viewpoint here, because from a toxicological viewpoint, you have to take account of the sensitivity of the individual that you're exposing. And it's not just CNS which can be affected. If you take the Vietnamese War, where well, I'm just giving you some examples, they did the Agent Orange, and that was a dioxin which was contaminated with TCDD, which is a nasty contaminant, and that affected. And that was given as a herbicide to get rid of the forestation, so that the Viet Cong couldn't hide in the bushes. But it also affected the food crops, and people were very badly affected. And for generations, they've had defects and things like that. So reproductive effects, terrible, nasty distortions of faces and the children and so on. So that was one, and then you have the Tokyo underground, where it was, I think 15 people were killed there and 5,000 were sort of had terrible trouble after. And that was an organophosphate. And then you have the individual cases of the Bulgarian dissident writer who put a poison tip, or had a poison tip in his umbrella and was killed on London Bridge in broad daylight. And then, I can't know if I can pronounce this, Litvinenko, the man who was given polonium in his tea, blistered face, his hair fell out. And then the Ukrainian president took some soup containing dioxin and had the most terrible scars. Overnight he almost changed. So some people are very, very sensitive, and I don't know if, I mean, I think it's fantastic what you're doing, if I might say so, but I think it is a broad issue, not just CNS. I think it is all organs, and that's from a toxicologist viewpoint. Okay, now it's open for discussion.
I'm not a toxicologist. I'm a Geordie. I'm Steve Roy. I'm an ethics bod from Leeds, Beckett. It was interesting hearing about the chlorine in Wilfred again, because as a kid, I went to the library. I was an unusual child, and I actually learned how to make chlorine and used it on the gang fights in Newcastle. And it always had the air of surprise. No one expected a kid to come up with chlorine, and it completely incapacitated them. So my question is twofold. One is, I mean, I like the lecture. I think that you are uniquely qualified to explore the horizon of this. And I want to open up the debate about research and how to stop research that takes this into new capability sets. What I've got in mind is Schwabrova, the Czech doctor. Of course, she was lying. She gave a presentation where she showed weaponization, and she wanted to make a patent for a police gun. And at that conference, the only thing we could do to stop her was set the reptiles of the press onto her. And of course, all the world's media went to the hospital, and she had to go undercover. But she had a really important contribution to that debate. She found an antidote with a mixture of the agent. And of course, the Russians know that now, so the knowledge is out there. So that relates to my second question. It's what should we do about the research? Should the scientific ethos of open research now have limits? Because you know the convergence of biology and chemistry is giving these new capabilities. And one of your colleagues was speaking in Leeds this afternoon, Paul Rogers, and we're talking about the whole question of a £300 million a month terrorist organisation that can buy that capacity on the international market. So, Michael, if they went to China, I don't think that the company there would refuse them to sell that capability set. They would. So I want you to speculate and think about non-state actors, because you've been very erudite about controlling the state actors. But where are we going with maybe ISIS deciding to take out Western leadership with drones armed with new capacities that we're talking? Thanks.
Who's going to answer that?
Well, I want to start not with Steve, but back to our chair. We all tend to forget about Agent Orange. It's something that is just not talked about. But there's a guy sitting at the back there who has in his filing cabinet a vast collection of documents demonstrating just what happened with Agent Orange. And if you want to understand the kind of dangers that we face in this area, you just have to read some of those documents and understand that Agent Orange use in Vietnam was biological and chemical warfare in action. Massive, massive amounts of this agent poured all over an ecosystem and destroyed a mangrove ecosystem completely. So here you have the use of, people always call it a chemical agent, but for me it's a bioregulator. So it's a biological agent as well. And here you have a demonstration of the dangers that we could fall into. It's almost like going back to the First World War with massive amounts of carefully calculated attempts to use these kind of agents for military purposes. So I just wanted to remark again, and I don't know whether Simon might say something about it later on. Turning now to, I think your question is multi-pronged, but can I just take one of them? There's been a huge debate going on amongst the security community and embracing more and more some of the life science community about so-called dual-use research, and particularly dual-use research of concern. Dual-use research of concern might be best understood as research which could relatively easily produce results or agents or understanding that could be relatively easily misused for hostile purposes. And there's a very good commentary in last year on a paper which demonstrated a new form of botulinum toxin.
Right.
Yeah, this new form of botox, one of the first, I think the first one for about 40 years that we have a new form of botulinum toxin. And the commentary was by David Roman, who was one of the people who produced a major report for the US National Academies on this issue. And Roman said he approved of what the journal did in redacting certain information about this new form of botulinum toxin until an antidote had been produced. He said he thought that was a sensible thing to do. But what he also argued was that that was a relatively simple case. And as our understanding of the life sciences proceeds apace during this century, we will find more and more complicated and difficult issues of that kind, which won't be so easily resolved. And he argued, and he's a life scientist of some standing, that until the life science community takes on board the possibility that some experiments should not be done, that there may be some kind of point at which you say, no, we don't do that, it's too dangerous, it's too easily misused. Until that's taken on board, then the life science community is still adrift without a proper understanding of the issues that are being developed, evolved as its progress continues. I think Mike,
yeah.
you want to?
Well, I just wanted to come back. Firstly, I mean, you made a very important point about the range of toxic chemicals that could be used as weapons, and that it wasn't just CNS acting agents. We concentrated on the ICA weapons and research potentially related to that, because we saw, well, firstly, I think it's important to underline that all toxic agents, if they are intended as weapons in armed conflict, are captured by the Chemical Weapons Convention. So the full range of the types of agents that you highlighted, if they're used as weapons in armed conflict, would be absolutely prohibited. And if a state
or if a state uses them, then the rest of the international community would come down heavily on them, and you'd get UN resolutions and whatnot. If a non-state actor got their hands on it, then non-state actors are not directly covered by the Chemical Weapons Convention, but all the states in the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention are obliged to ensure that they control what's going on in their country and pass national implementing legislation and enact national implementing legislation that stops non-state actors from acquiring these agents and weaponizing these agents. So the range of agents, including those that you highlighted, would be covered under both conventions. The danger is, of course, whether the will of the states parties, the international community, is there to enforce those conventions. And in certain cases, in certain countries, it is, but in other cases, for other countries, it may not be. And one of what we saw with ICA weapons is that this sort of interface of these CNS acting agents, when applied for law enforcement purposes, could be a loophole, a gateway that allows far broader application of a new range of weapons, which is why we concentrated on that. With regard to Steve and our states doing enough on non-state actors, firstly, we tried to find examples of the use of ICAs by non-state actors, and we couldn't find any. But that's not to say that research is not going on. The CWC states parties, the BTWC states parties, I'd say that they are keener to stop any such research by non-state actors than they would be to stop research by certain states parties. And in fact, the current Director General of the CWC has highlighted consistently its potential application as an aid to anti-terrorist enforcement measures.
There are two more questions here. We have a lady and then a gentleman. And can I just say, I know the official time to finish is 7, but if you're prepared to... Three questions. If you're... 4. What time? It's all right, for the discussion. Wonderful. Okay, so we've got time for 4 questions. You might think of more during the session. All right.
My question's related to the last one. Could you just explain to me in very simple terms how this works? Here I am in my lab as a biochemist, and I may be doing pure research, or I may be doing applied research in agriculture or in medicine or pharmaceuticals, and I discover working with my animals some slight effect that is interesting, and perhaps not what I expected, and perhaps could be quite dangerous, say an effect on the nervous system. Now, do I have to report that to anybody? Because if I don't have to report to that, what's stopping me then quietly getting on with that, not publishing, because if I publish, somebody will know about it. What's to stop me just getting on quietly, producing these agents in my lab, in this country, or perhaps in other countries? I'm really interested in the process.
Well then, we have the gentleman here who can answer it.
So you are quietly in your lab getting on producing a new form of chemical agent that you have some inkling would be useful for doing harm to other people. I think you might find the police knocking on your door quite quickly.
But who would I tell? I mean, I might not tell if I saw this.
Well, you could tell your director.
Let's put it round this way. What you were doing would be edging towards illegality. But more importantly, I think, unless you're a very unusual life scientist, you would have very little knowledge of the context in which your activities were taking place. One of the things that I was involved in during the 2005, 2006, 2007 was going around talking to thousands of practicing life scientists, asking them questions about this issue of potentially dual-use research. And the overwhelming result of all of those conversations was that almost no practicing life scientists we came across knew anything at all about the problem of biosecurity or chemical security. And if you look at the report of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Chemical Weapons Convention Temporary Working Group on Education and Awareness Raising, you'll find that that is exactly what they reported for chemists last year. And so in the Chemical Weapons Convention, you have the Organisation for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, a Scientific Advisory Board able to set up a working group to look at this, and the working group has reported that it suggests that there's a continuing advisory board reporting to the Director General to make sure that the education of chemists about these security issues is pursued properly in all of the countries that are party to the convention. If you go to the nuclear area, there's been a 10-year intensive, well-funded program out of the International Atomic Energy Agency to improve the education of nuclear scientists and people associated with nuclear science. Indeed, there's an international nuclear security education network set up, producing model lectures, model courses, model textbooks. Unfortunately, in the biological area, it's very much less organised, less well-funded, less well thought through. So although there are initiatives in different countries, what you have to say is that in the biological area, the progress in education and awareness raising amongst practicing scientists is way, way behind the curve of the nuclear and will fall very rapidly behind the curve of the chemical.
Here's our next question.
Thank you. Peter Myers, why do chemical weapons have an apparently uniquely abhorrent status in the world, perhaps more so than every other weapon? And how can we all help to maintain that abhorrent status?
Have we got that one?
Yeah, very good question. I'd say that chemical weapons and also biological weapons have for centuries, thousands of years, been taboo. The idea of poisoning people or causing disease and killing or incapacitating people that way has always been abhorrent to us as human beings. I don't know why that is the case. I'm glad it is, but it's a taboo or two taboos that have been nurtured for hundreds, if not thousands, of years in the earliest legal systems. Such taboos are in place, and then gradually over time they've been brought up to date through, well, most recently the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, but before that you had the Geneva Protocol and previous international agreements banning both biological weapons and chemical weapons. So I agree, the taboo on both sorts of weapons is there. Our concern is that by exploring what some states consider are grey areas, like using certain toxic chemicals for law enforcement, that taboo becomes eroded and less strong. And when that taboo goes, then the concern is that one state, two states, more states will begin to conduct research, start utilising it for limited purposes, perhaps for law enforcement situations in certain circumstances. But if that becomes acceptable, then those circumstances of use might become broader and might bleed from law enforcement into limited armed conflict, and then into full-scale international armed conflict and warfare. So I don't know why that taboo is there. I'm glad that it's in our nature that to abhor such weapons. But unless that taboo is monitored, policed by states, but also by civil society, by all of us in scientific community, health professionals, and everybody. To make sure that our governments are not undermining that taboo, then we'd be in rocky times.
To address the second part of your question, Peter, how do we maintain that taboo? I think eternal vigilance is what's required. For example, what are we to make of the work financed by the US National Institutes of Health, carried on in the Netherlands quite recently, in which scientists thought it was reasonable to take a deadly influenza and try to work out how it would be transmissible through the air amongst ferrets, which are the standard model for transmission through the air amongst human beings. So here we have people in their lab thinking it's sensible to go down the road of making aerosol transmissible deadly influenza. And you think to yourself, well, set aside the fact that, that recently what they had the CDC in Atlanta with biosafety problems. We've had, where was it, in New York, somebody discovered that there were collections of viable smallpox, which somebody had forgotten about. So set aside all these problems of biosafety, you start thinking about how are they going to look after that stuff and make sure it's secure in the laboratories, and why were they doing it anyway? And if they were doing it for some good purpose, where was the risk-benefit analysis that was carried out? What kind of insurance did the university have against a class action amongst a number of people whose family had been wiped out by the deadly influenza? So I think some serious thinking about these kind of issues amongst professional scientists is also necessary.
Let's leave it there.
Why don't we take two questions? You're right there. We could take two questions at a time, and she's right there.
Okay, sorry.
It's a good follow-on, actually, I think, from the gentleman's question over there. But it's clear from your talk the ethical status of chemical weapons in general within the international community. But on the surface, the Russians seem to have felt that it was a lesser evil using CNS-acting ICAs, incapacitating agents, than death by explosion. So can you explain to lay people, because I'm not a scientist or an academic or a peace studies person, why ICAs in particular are anathema, especially within the context of both law and military, but whereas something like nuclear weapons don't seem to have that status? And is it just a slippery slope argument? That's all I've heard so far? It's a genuine question.
Do we take the two? Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions. I was wondering, what is the incapacitating agent that soldiers are exposed to in basic combat training? I know they are in the United States, and I suspect it's the same for the UK, so I was just wondering. And two, I was wondering, in your research, did you consider who is funding the academic research, if it's life science companies or if it's other states? I'm also wondering about independent verification, and if you can really trust the claims by the US and the UK that they're not developing these ICA agents. I'm thinking about how senior officials in the British and American militaries, said under oath recently that they weren't engaged in mass surveillance. And of course, the Edward Snowden NSA leaks revealed that that is what's happening. So they're engaged in illegal behavior. We know from military budgets that there's black boxes on new weapons technologies. Then I was just wanting to let you know that the legacy of Agent Orange, it was tested in Canada, it was tested in Alberta and in Brunswick, and it was just last year that a court of appeal in Canada forced the federal government to compensate Canadian soldiers who were exposed in the 1960s to Agent Orange. So now they're finally, under Veterans Affairs, given compensation as a disability. But the federal government, the government of Canada, is refusing to uphold an election promise to have a full parliamentary public inquiry into the use of Agent Orange in Canada. Still today, they will refuse to do it. And then finally, I just want to say that the next Peace Studies event is happening next Thursday at March 12th at 1 o'clock. The author of The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade is speaking, and it's chaired by Owen Green. I have posters here. Thank you.
Can I take the first question to start with? I should make it clear that I'm totally opposed to nuclear weapons as well, okay. Just so that we know where we stand.
As am I.
Why ICAs in particular? Given the impossible situation that the Russian forces were in, you can see the dilemma that they had. But if you think more broadly, you've got a massive revolution going on in the life sciences and associated sciences, which will inevitably open up new possibilities for misuse. Benignly intended work will open up our understanding of specific neuronal mechanisms. There's no doubt that that's going to happen. If we don't close down on ICAs, if instead of this restricted understanding of what can be done, you have a permissive understanding, then what you will see almost certainly is various attempts to develop new forms of ICAs. And other state parties looking at that and starting off by saying, okay, if that's what's going on, we need to look at it. We need to start thinking about defense. And then perhaps discovering something even better. And then the other parties starts thinking, well, if they've discovered something like that, then what do we have to do? So what you end up with is an erosion of the central provision of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and incidentally also the Biological Weapons Convention. And down the road, therefore, you end up with a free-for-all. You have an erosion of two of the major conventions which are keeping weapons of mass destruction at bay at the present time.
It's a clear path to escalation.
Pardon?
It's a clear path to escalation.
It's a clear path, I would say, to erosion of the central provision. And if you erode the central provision, then God only knows what happens next. So that's the reason for putting a finger on ICAs. There are other places where one could have equal concern, but that's what we did last year.
Yeah, and just going back to previous questioner, there is a taboo on chemical weapons, on biological weapons, and among right-thinking people on nuclear weapons as well. But our concern was, the sort of acceptance in certain quarters, in certain states, of let's do this research if it's just for this discrete area, because everybody knows, these are impossible situations of anti-terrorist operations, really, really difficult. How do we conduct them without great loss of life? So, it is an impossible situation, but if you open up that door with ICAs, then it leads to a potentially horrendous future. Just your question. I think that soldiers, well, in certain states, are trained with riot control agents as dummies for surrogates for other chemical weapons when they do their chemical weapons defense training, I believe. But your other questions, can you trust what the US are saying or what the UK are saying? Right, well, the US, and we've sort of detailed it in the publication, has an extremely long track record of active research in incapacitating chemical agents. And starting off in the very late 1940s, early 1950s, and in the 1960s, actually weaponized 60,000 kilograms of BZ, an early incapacitating chemical agent, into two types of munitions, including cluster bombs. And that went into the US arsenal in 1964. It was never used, or they were never used. And then in the 1980s and early 1990s, they were all destroyed. But in the 1990s, the US restarted research in a growing way in ICA weapons. So it has a long history of interest in these weapons. The UK has also a history of research regarding ICAs and stopped, and then it sort of explored the possibility of using tranquilizers in the early to mid 2000s, and there was a formal process by which a range of new non-lethal weapons were explored, and they were formally, ICAs and tranquilizers for law enforcement were formally rejected as a possible weapon. But can we trust what government officials say? Good question. I think what's really important is you mentioned independent verification. I think there's independent verification at a national level, partially if the parliamentary and congressional oversight bodies are doing the job that they should be doing. They should be holding people to account for what they're saying and making sure that what they say is reality. But also the OPCW, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, conducts regular inspections all around the world in potential places where chemical weapons could be developed. And I'm sure Porton Down is definitely on their list of sites to see. But there's not enough resources for that organisation, and there are a vast number of establishments for it to inspect. So whether it inspects all the sites in a regular enough way is another question. So those verification measures are potentially there. Whether they are being implemented is another question entirely.
Just to add to that, it's one thing for a state to make an official statement at the OPCW saying we have nothing to do with this. It's another step to say, and we want to talk about an agreement that what we are doing is what everybody else will do. Because inherent in talking and coming to an agreement about none of us will do this is verification.
Yeah.
Because I cannot imagine state parties spending all the time to work out exactly that they all agree that this is not going to be done without somebody raising the question, and it's a state that near your own state would raise the question, how can we be sure that other people are doing what they say they're doing?
Right, now we've got 1 minute to go. Has anybody got anything they want to say desperately? Please do.
I'll be very brief. Chris Butler. I'm surprised, Malcolm, that you separate out biological effects from the effects of radiation. I mean, after all, radiation can produce some very devastating effects on the body. You know, it's pretty awful stuff. And I'm not just thinking about high levels of radiation. If you remember some years ago, we looked at the possibility of the effects of low-level radiation, way below the normal threshold for effects of radiation. And we look at the question of depleted uranium, for example. I mean, they're not just used for busting tanks. These shells have been left around, giving off very low levels of radiation and affecting a considerable number of people. I'm just a little confused about why you seem to want to separate those two.
We are distorted personalities. We think in terms not of bodies and people. We come at the other end through conventions, and we have the unfortunate situation in which rather than one convention we have three, and there are different parties, different rules, different regulations, and there's a really big problem, for instance, just in regard to the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. In the middle, both conventions should be covering things like toxins and bioregulators, but there's a really big worry that the Chemical Weapons Convention is looking after chemicals and the Biological Weapons Convention is looking after biological agents. And in the middle, the toxins and the bioregulators are not thought to be the business of this one or this one, and we have a gaping hole in the middle. And that's the next paper we're writing.
Right. Thank you very much for coming. It's been a very interesting session. I hope you all enjoyed it, and you'll come again the next one.